And as he talked about his past, he waved his hand forward. He said, "The things I remember about my past." I said, "Don't you mean your past?" He said, "No." He said, "My past is before my eyes as if it were today. My future I have no idea about." And that sort of analogizes identity-based conflict. People who have been in identity-based conflict, the past, the resonance of the past lives with them every moment. I had an Israeli-Palestinian student a couple years ago when I was a Fulbright professor in northern Israel, who told me the classic story of the Palestinian key. I don't know if you have heard these stories, but so many Palestinians keep a key from the home that they were exiled from within what is now the state of Israel. And this granddaughter talked about her grandfather in his dying days, desperately wanting to go visit his home. He wanted to see what that home was like, just to remember it. So they made the trip to the Jewish village and knocked on the door and said, "This was once our home, we'd like to come in." And the woman slammed the door in their face. And as the student was telling me the story, she was getting very teary-eyed and very hurt, and told me in a very quiet but infuriated voice, her grandfather died soon after. So after sitting with her for a while, I basically said, "And why do you think she slammed the door on you?" She said, "I understand that. She felt that if we let her in, we would stay. She was afraid of us." So that's a person who had done her own work, able to understand the other side. I must say, I went to Cyprus very soon after for a visit then as well. And this is the Annan plan had just failed when I was there, which was an effort by the UN to sort of coerce unity of the island. One thing that I saw there, I'd been going back and forth for a couple decades, is in fact the people have begun to change their attitudes towards each other from 2 decades ago. There have been a lot of encounters, there have been a lot of workshops where folks have articulated their stories about themselves and their antagonisms towards each other. And I heard stories such as this, which was a Turkish Cypriot saying to me, "Now the borders are open, and many Greek Cypriots are coming back to their gardens, wanting to visit them, and we're saying, welcome. This was once your land. This fruit is still your fruit. Come and eat of it." I said, "How can you do that? Don't you think they're going to take it from you?" "No, it's ours. But it also was theirs, and we can share it with them." Very different attitude. A much more future-oriented attitude, at least among my small sample. Whereas the Israelis and Palestinians are both very much engaged in the past. Okay, so if we have this identity-based conflict, we need to bring it up. So let me make this simpler. So our resources, objectives, identities, antagonism, and this is the name of my company and work. So if we have an identity-based conflict, we really have to go right to the antagonism. But you can't just lay it all out there. When you're going to bring folks together, you have to choreograph it, really. So you choreograph it in the way I was talking about, through the intragroup conditioning of saying, what are the things that we're upset about them? What makes them our problem? And then we go through that process of having each side basically blame the other. And it's very hard. But again, it's bringing out intensively that past that they're living with so deeply and is playing on them. Instead of them playing, I don't mean to be lighthearted, them playing with it, which is we're going to frame issues in terms of that past that lives in us, and then we're going to reframe it in terms of our aspirations and our resonance, what matters to us so deeply, in terms of why we care. Okay? So that's what we do with identity-based conflict. If we have goal-based conflict, we don't have to do that. And this is the kind of getting to yes approach, more about interests and so forth. Then we can move into figure out why these interests are important to us or why our goals are important to us, and then be integrative, inventive, okay? And then finally, moving into a sustained action plan. How do we keep this work going? It's not enough to change the agenda. It's gigantic. It's probably the biggest part of the work. It's the work of going slow to go fast. That is, I think our work is about getting an analysis which is a more constructive, creative analysis about conflict, getting an understanding with the other sides that's more creative and constructive, and doing that in a long way. And if we do that in a long way, then as we get into invention and action, it's much shorter. That is, if we get the frame right, if we build this cooperative understanding and dynamic in terms of how we conceptualize the conflict that we're in, then our ability to be inventive and sustain that invention is so much greater than if we do what normally is done, is going this short, long way. That is, here's the problem, we'll tell you what the problem is, now let's solve it. And then we never do. Just stretches out forever. So part of our work, I think, as a field and as interveners, is to be able to help people think differently about peace, think differently about themselves and each other. And again, doing this from the inside out. Okay. So, really, part of what I'm talking about also is what's our orientation when we're doing this conflict engagement work? Is our orientation about working with the past, or is our orientation about working with the future? And when is it which? I think, particularly in identity-based conflicts, it's about both, but it's about sequencing. So the main difference between goal-oriented, and I use objectives and goals interchangeably, just so you know, in America we have a notion of ROI, return on investment. It's a corporate concept. The more I invest in something, the more I'll get a return on my investment. So I'm also playing with metaphors here, just like I do with aria. Conflict can be creative, can be musical, can be constructive, but we have to invest in it. But so when we have goal conflicts about the future and identity conflicts about the past, right? That's the main difference, is our orientation. The former looks to some new future, goals. Differences in goals arise over definitions, interests, and priorities. Oftentimes, a major reason for goal conflicts between groups is that goals are ill-defined, and unresolved goal conflicts within each then spills over into the goal conflicts between the sides. When each side is really clear about what it wants, and more importantly, why it wants it, its ability to express that to the other side cogently, coherently, and persuasively is so much greater than when each side has a confusion and not a very clear hierarchy of their goals. Now, identity-based conflict looks back at what Volkan calls some set of chosen traumas from the past, and the way in which they continue to influence and cloud the present. Volkan suggests that in all ethnic conflicts, parties select certain historical traumas they have suffered and hold fast to as ways of defining their distinctive identity. We have suffered in this way. This gives us a stake and a distinction. They're often symbolized in specific historical events, and sometimes even with artifacts. An example of the latter is like the key I just discussed. Palestinian key represents this chosen trauma. For the Israeli Jews, the chosen trauma is very clearly the Holocaust and the memorial sites and so forth that are throughout Israel. Okay. So in conflict resolution, or conflict management field, there's a common distinction made between positions and interests. Right? That's what Urey and Fisher in their book Getting to Yes talk about. The former are those unbridgeable attitudes and beliefs about a conflict that divides parties from each other. The latter are understood as underlying concerns that overlap in interdependent ways that can be met through cooperative and functional solutions. That's the conventional way of distinguishing in our field, positions and interests. I think the distinction between identities and goals is a much more complex and therefore requires a much more precise approach. This is partly the case because all identity conflicts, as I suggested at the beginning, contain goal conflicts and resources. Right? So any identity conflict is also going to have goals and also going to have resources in it. So it's multi-layered in and of itself. Whereas goal conflicts are usually more about themselves and about resources, and resource conflicts are more just about themselves. So they're the simplest type. Some would say identities are constituted of specific goal configurations, in which, as an example, someone would have intrapsychic conflicts within their own various internal goal fields. For example, as a hardworking professional, a devoted parent, and the competing time demands and constraints upon each role. Just as groups could have internally and externally contending goals. The complexity is what commonly leads people to believe that all conflicts are identity-based. I believe this is an important mistake as well, that leads to imprecision in conflict analysis. In many ways, people start learning about identity conflict, and then they think, now that I know what identity conflict, everything is an identity conflict. If everything's an identity conflict, then we've lost the precision that we need to figure out what sorts of intervention we need to do when. So part of a contingency model would help to address this. We have to be able to get some kind of precise ways of understanding what constitutes identity conflict, what constitutes goal conflicts, what constitute resource conflicts, and which types of interventions do we need to use when. So sometimes a resource is just a resource. A cigar is just a cigar, or goals are simply goals. But oftentimes they are masking underlying dynamics that need to be surfaced and engaged, as I think is the case in so many of our protracted conflicts. Okay, so here's the process again, to repeat, that I've been experimenting with for many years. First of all, intra-group goal setting. What is it that my side wants with all of its diversity before I meet with them? What is it that are our ideals as a community, irrespective of what they've done to us or our grievances of them? What is it that makes us a community in search of some sort of a future that we want to live into? And what are our differences about our goals? Okay? Then we have an intergroup encounter, potentially, about this, which is we're going to come together with you to talk with you about our goals. We're not yet going to talk with you about our grievances, and see if, in that context, we can reach agreement on our goals. If we can reach agreement on our goals across our two sides, then we have a goal-based conflict, and we can move from here. With me? Now, last year we did this with a group of Israelis and Palestinians who were setting up a project together. They were all peace seekers, and we weren't sure how much we needed to work on their own grievances about each other. We knew they had to work on it with Israelis and Palestinians, but we thought as fellow peace seekers they'd be able to define this project and its purposes in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict quite effectively. Well, we had a fascinating experience where we had each side define not only the purposes for this project, but the way they hoped the project would influence a solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And what happened here is that the Israelis basically articulated, the Palestinians' main goal of their project, of this project, called the Kumi project, was to end the occupation. The Israelis said their goal was to transform the conflict and end the occupation as a short-term goal. Does this sound like overlapping goals? Palestinians to end the occupation. 3 words. Israelis transform the conflict and to end the occupation as a short-term goal. So I said, it sounds like you have common goals. And if you have common goals, let's talk about why that goal matters to you, and let's talk about how this project can help to build progress towards that common goal. Palestinians said, we don't have a common goal with them. They said, the question of ending the occupation should take precedence over anything else. The Israelis say, as a short-term goal, to transform the conflict. Right? For the Israelis, ending the occupation is a means to an end. Right? Two-state solution, security of Israel as a Jewish state. It's a whole bunch of other. For the Palestinians, ending the occupation is an identity need at this point, so they were saying. In and of itself, it's an identity need in conflict, and we have great grievance about the occupation that we want to surface. So we had to go backwards. We couldn't go forwards. We couldn't say, okay, now that we know that we have a shared goal, let's figure out why that goal matters to us, let's invent solutions for it, how we're going to design our project, and then let's implement those. No, we don't have a shared goal. We have a grievance about the whole notion of occupation and what ending it means, what its purposes are about, what its basic underlying focus. So then we went back to do the other workshop, which we said, okay, now, Israelis, what are your grievances about Palestinians? Our grievances about the Palestinians is all they are is thinking about themselves. Our grievance about the Palestinians is they don't include us in their solution, etc. And they went on and on. And the Palestinians said the grievance of the Israelis is they're oppressing us. Or specifically to quote, Israeli complaints, you speak as representatives of Palestinians, not as a unique individual. Palestinians ending the occupation is conditioned with a process that may take a long time and may not be applicable to our needs. Israeli, if end of occupation is a primary goal, we only work on structure. Conflict will not be transformed and violence will continue. Palestinian lack of direct action on the ground as peace believers. You don't make anything happen. Anyway, so they kept going. They articulated their grievances in their own side. They bring them together. They have this dialogue that ends up going nowhere. We ask them now, having said all of that and put on the table those things that make them antagonistic towards each other, to say now, go back and talk about why your grievances are so important to you. Right, so they go back to their separate sides, and now they can begin here. Now they go from there. Okay, so we have reframed it now from an identity-based conflict where we have to get our grievances out, we have to articulate our differences from you, to a much more goal-based conflict, which is now that we've been able to articulate what it is that keeps us separate. How can we find within our purposes, within our own narratives, possibility of linking us into some future together? Okay, I think this might be the place to start transitioning into the next phase. And so it is. Let me summarize this and then get you ready after the break for what we're going to do. So let me repeat my main hypothesis here. A major reason negotiations over identity-based conflicts fail is that there's inadequate attention given to intra-group pre-negotiation, whether that is over goals or identities. Too often conflicts go from bad to worse when opponents in ethnic and identity-based conflict prematurely meet and try to solve problems or negotiate solutions before sufficient intra-group agreement and conditioning has occurred. Instead, intra-group pre-negotiation, focusing first on internal dynamics of disagreement and consensus within conflict parties, could enhance the chances of success between parties. I believe that insufficient focus on each side's internal conflicts fundamentally prevents sufficient change, much less sustainable change, in the hearts of minds of participants in these intergroup encounters. Without this focus of intra-group pre-negotiation, conflicts with the other side become a source for deeper division within each side. Hamas and the PLO, the right wing and the left wing in Israel. Their divisions are deeper and more intransigent than they've ever been before. that is, within one's own group. Then the agenda for encounter within the other side, including negotiation, reverts to a more aggressive win-lose dynamic that characterizes deep conflict. On the other hand, conflicts within groups become projected onto conflict with the other side, and intractability follows. Moreover, if intergroup encounter and negotiation is somewhat successful, parties bridging differences and reaching agreements within their own sides, it is not uncommon for their respective hardliners to then blow up, sometimes quite literally, agreements reached before in the negotiation room. Even if this doesn't happen, the fear that it will often keeps each side closed and fearful about taking risks and building bridges. Thus, another benefit of adequate pre-negotiation in a process of post-negotiation, in which sides work separately and as useful in a coordinated way, is to package private agreements for at-home public consumption, one of the main definitions of pre-negotiation. Private agreements reached between the sides for what they're going to communicate to their publics who might otherwise undermine the agreements that they've accomplished. Okay? All right, that's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of words. I'm happy to share this paper with you later. Let me know if you want a copy. But part of what I'm doing here is setting up sort of a theoretical construct for a case study we're going to look at after the break. This is a case study of conflict that blew up in Cincinnati, Ohio in 2001. It took place in about April of 2001, 6 months before September 11. Sort of a very, very powerful link. It took place when an African-American youth, 17 years old, was wanted for misdemeanors, and the police were chasing him in a dark alley and ended up shooting him and killing him. It was seen by the Cincinnati black citizens as one in a series of such incidences. Actually, over the last 5 years, 17 African males had been shot and killed. And it led to what has been variously described: riots, civil unrest, public disturbances. And that lasted for about 3 days in Cincinnati. Anybody remember those 2001 riots in Cincinnati? It had some international reverberation. England actually put a travel ban on Cincinnati. And there's a lot of things that were notable about what happened after, but also quite notable about what happened before. What happened before is that there was a federal judge who had been a domestic relations attorney in her past. And she had worked with couples in conflict and understood that when couples are in conflict, divorcing or disputing, it's often about deeper issues of identity. And she said she thought this was a conflict that was about deeper issues. And this conflict, being the conflict of racial profiling that had been happening all over America then, still is, and certainly happening in Europe, ethnic profiling. And more such cases were coming to her desk. And she said, instead of bringing a lawsuit about this, I'd like us to do some kind of a mediated or collaborative process. This was 6 weeks before the riots. Anyway, you'll hear about this in a film that was made by BBC. And we'll show that after the break. So we were there before. I was asked by the federal judge to organize this collaborative. We were limping along, actually, until the riots actually happened, till the conflict exploded. The identity issues came to the fore. And then we began to work on a future-oriented process, which was beginning with goals for the future and stories about why that future mattered to all the participants, and we went forward. It's now 10 years later, and I'll share some good outcomes with you now, which even 2 years ago, I'm not sure I would have been able to say. One of the things that many of us felt was that the police force was dysfunctional, and its dysfunctionality was fed by a dysfunctional leader. And then one of the most important things that we could do was create a new culture that would push the leader out. Many of us said that. Well, the chief of police is still there. The mayor's gone. Most of the city council members are gone. most of the community doesn't remember this process that fully, although it's in there. But the chief is there and he's different. He's changed. I've been interviewing people and said, what is the most significant change? And they say the most significant change is that the police officer the chief is now creating a culture where the police asks the community for its help and consults with the community when it's having a particular set of dilemmas about civil disturbance. So it's a fascinating transformation that actually began with the bottom, as you'll see, when the community set a new agenda, and then eventually reverberated up to the top with the leadership saying, we've heard and we'll follow. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break.
I need 1 second, Jay.
Sure.
Are you okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good. The break will also be the time for social interaction. And since some of you, me included, don't wear our name badges anymore, I would kindly ask you, everybody in a circle, to just say your name, your country, the one that you live in now. If you have also country of origin, you can say both. And one word that comes to your mind right now. I will start with that. We don't need the microphone, but speak out loudly. So I will start and then we make a tour. So I'm Pascal, Switzerland.